Greetings, friends. Juan Ingriska here, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of April 22nd through April 28th of 2024. And this week we have a ton of updates. But before we get into those updates for this past week, make sure to subscribe to my channel to continue getting updates on the Russo-Ukrainian War, and be sure to give this video a thumbs up. Sweet. Now, this week we have probably some of the most changing big updates in the war in Ukraine in the last, for a big while. And, if you guys have followed my last video, we're back in Avdiivka, you might be wondering, holy crap, what in the world, what happened? I mean, I'm going to go over what happened, because it's pretty interesting. So, the big news of today was the complete capture of the village of Ocheretyne, or the town of Ocheretyne. This is a town of about 3,000 people. And now there's something called the Ocheretyne flower. What that means, if you guys don't know, is that when you capture a critical junction point, a critical point in a enemy's defense line, you're able to expand out of that and take a bunch of land. We saw this, for example, in the early stages of the war with the Popasna flower, if you remember that. Popasna was one of the most strongest defenses that the Ukrainians had to help secure this area. And when the Russians captured Popasna, they managed to expand north, to the west, and the south very quickly, because Popasna held a very strong defensive. It was on the high ground. It was kind of the dominating part around the whole area. And this is the same thing with Ocheretyne. Ocheretyne is on the high ground, and it is the biggest kind of. It's like wedged in the middle of all these little villages on the lower ground. And because of that, since the Russians were able to capture it, it's now expanding into a flower. And we're going to continue seeing that for the rest of this, for the next few weeks. And so, you might be wondering, they captured Ocheretyne, how in the world? And, I would have been surprised too. This town was almost taken, almost without a fight. What happened was the forces of the 115th brigade for Ukraine were in charge of this area, and right now the details are unknown, but because of some sort of maybe confusion with the rotation or whatnot, those units were very fresh. They got sent in here, got completely blasted, and they're like, oh shit, they're bombing us to hell, let's retreat. And there was no one there to replace them, to fall back. So the Russians, and we talked about how the Russians had some sort of little bridgehead here on the outskirts of Ocheretyne, and I talked about how big of a breakthrough that was. But I didn't know they were going to take all of it. I thought, they were going to stabilize the situation, but the Ukrainians did not. They said they would. They were going to bring back a unit they were trying to put out for rotation. Sadly, that, depending on who you ask, that unit, which is a Western supplied NATO brigade, the ones with the Leopards and Bradleys and such, they got blasted, and they have not changed the situation. And so all of Ocheretyne fell. The Ukrainians the complete collapse of Ocheretyne was a big goal. I mean, I thought, okay, maybe they might, there's going to be a big battle for the train station, and then they're going to have to there's going to be, there's this brick factory and this kind of high-rise buildings area, and I'm like, there's going to, it's going to take a while for the Russians to clear Ocheretyne, and no, this week it completely fell. In fact, it fell very fast within a few days. Now, it took the Russians a few times to comb over this area. Remember, the Ukrainians have been using this as a fortress for, it was one of the key nodes of their defense, and so there was a bunch of Ukrainian defenses here, and they have to comb through it. Some Ukrainians didn't escape, and so it took them a few days to clear it. But in terms of fighting, it collapsed in 3 days or so. Ocheretyne is very important. As I mentioned, it's on the high ground, and this is going to turn into the Ocheretyne flower. The capture of this town of 3,000 people is very, very, very significant in terms of in this tactical situation, in terms of this Avdiivka direction. And we'll explain that in a second. But basically, if I want to explain to you what happened, they basically wedged into here, and the 115th Brigade just decided to fuck off. They decided to leave. I don't know, whatever happened, the Russians basically managed to enter the center of the settlement. There's been geolocated footage of the Russians hoisting their flag in the center of the village here. and or the center of the town, and capturing the railway, capturing the center, and then now we've seen um, you know Russian forces being able to consolidate themselves in more areas. And after they took the center of the town, they basically took them a while to clear out the brick factory, and took them a while to clear out these high-rise buildings, but not much. It just took them a while to go like house to house, apartment to apartment in these areas, clearing out the basements and stuff. And so it took a while, but they finally captured Ocheretyne in full after basically they gave up this critical junction, and the Russians exploited it and took it. And now it's apparently the Ukrainians can't lodge them out of there. The time to do that would have been when they had a small little bridgehead here, when it was this like extension into Ocheretyne, but that's no longer the case. And so Ocheretyne has fallen. This is a big gain for the Russians. And now let's talk about now that the Russians have captured Ocheretyne, what happened? What do I mean by the Ocheretyne flower? So everything around Ocheretyne is now in the lowlands, and we actually saw this here. And I actually talked about this in my last video about how if Ocheretyne falls, then this part of the Ukrainian defenses in Novobukhovka and Selidova would completely collapse, and that's what we saw. Once we saw Ocheretyne literally just collapse, like like a rubble, with like a creaking old building in a thunderstorm, like this completely collapse. Once this collapsed very rapidly, Ukrainians, the Russians were like right on top of them. They were right, in the bottom here, and so kind of attacking from two directions. The Ukrainians in Novobukhovka were like, "Wow, this is going to be." They almost gave up this without a fight. There was clashes here. The Ukrainians didn't just give up this as extremely fast, but they these two villages fell very very fast. Basically, they once Ocheretyne couldn't get recaptured by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are probably were hoping that the Ukrainians doing counterattacks here would retake this town, but that didn't happen. And so because of that, the Russians took Novobukhovka, and because the Russians also kind of took this kind of extension here, they kind of expanded themselves a little bit further west. They also managed to attack Selidova and advance. Basically, once this area was taken, the Russians attacked from two areas here, and Novobukhovka fell. And once Novobukhovka fell, they basically went to, they're like, oh, we can now also attack from the south and again from the west or from the east. And then the same thing happened with Selidova. We also have geolocated footage of the Russians hoisting their flag in Selidova. And so, and these two villages basically were now that they captured this, the southern part of the flanks of Ocheretyne are being secured at this very moment. Speaking of flanks, on the more eastern flank, this was another. Ocheretyne was kind of the main defense of the northern part of Avdiivka defense. But next was the Novokulinova and Keramik, and because of the capture of Ocheretyne, this basically really put a big strain on these two towns right here. And so the Russians basically broke through here and managed to, and now this source says that only half of these villages have, there's still battles going on here, and it's not as confirmed as Ocheretyne. However, it is almost all sources are saying that Novokulinova and Keramik have fallen to the Russians, and that the front line kind of goes something like this. Something like that. And that Keramik and Novokulinova have completely been taken. Right now, according to this map, to Syriac maps, the one I use, basically the Russians have taken the eastern part of Novokulinova and the center part of Novokulinova, but the more western part, these kind of two streets are still getting contested, and that the center of Keramik is being still contested, while the eastern part of Keramik has been taken. But as I mentioned, some sources say that these two villages are taken, regardless if, maybe they, a lot of these sources that aren't pro-Russian, even the pro-Ukrainian sources say that Novokulinova and Keramik have almost fallen as well. But sources that aren't pro-Russian usually wait a little. So usually pro-Russian sources usually have sources like on the ground. They have they talk to soldiers or people who are like war correspondents on the ground, and they are like, hey, yeah, this is what just happened, and and then they get to primary, they talk to primary sources, they're the secondary sources, and then kind of the more English pro-Russian sources kind of come from those sources. So it's like a territory or a third source, it's like a third source. So it's kind of like a, they kind of, sometimes they get ahead of them. They have direct lines of what's happening, while as neutral mappers like Syriac and Ukrainian ones obviously don't have those connections, but they kind of wait for geolocated footage, and we don't really see geolocated footage until a few days after the events. We saw that thing with Ocheretyne, for example. We didn't see Ocheretyne get completely captured until, painted in Russian, in this like color of Russian control, until a few days after it was confirmed that Ocheretyne, or was said that Ocheretyne was captured. So right now we're in this kind of thing where Russian sources are saying, yeah, we've captured Karamik, Novokolonova, and the front line now runs, something like this, and everything. But right now we don't have exact geolocated footage of, say, Russian troops in the middle of Karamik. We do have geolocated footage of Russian troops in the more eastern part of Novokolonova and Karamik. Regardless, these two villages, I mean, even if this is this continued configuration of the front line right now, I mean, there's no way the Ukrainians will be able to hold this. Again, this is the Ocheretyne flower. These two villages are on the low ground. Ocheretyne is on the high ground. Not only are they now going to be attacked directly from the south, but they also are now, their eastern part is cut off and they're being attacked from the east. And Ocheretyne basically allows the Russians to cut them off from the west. And so they're squeezed out, and I expect them to fall back to Arkhangelsk, and probably not even that, probably to a new defense line that, we'll see how in this area, which we'll talk about in a second here. But Novokolonova and Karamik, for all intents and purposes, has fallen. Like, this is, while Ocheretyne is 100% confirmed, we'll say this is like 90% confirmed. But regardless, even if it's not 100% taken, right, let's say right now they're doing clearing operations. By the end of next week, we should get confirmation that these two villages have completely fallen. So, yeah, so these two villages are falling, and not only that, we saw that the Russians are not stopping. They are not only have they gone south, they are trying to expand themselves from the north here, give themselves a little bit some breathing room here from the north, and they are now attacking Arkhangelsk. This is another village in the north that is on the low ground, and the Russians have taken kind of these gardening partnerships right here between Ocheretyne and Arkhangelsk. And if Karamik and Novokolonova have fallen, I expect Arkhangelsk to fall probably by the end of next week as well. So what are the Russians doing? Where are the Russians going to go? So once Arkhangelsk falls, which is a lot of sources are saying the Russians are doing attacks towards Arkhangelsk at this very moment, and so this is where the front line is going to kind of look like here. Let me redo this here. Let me kind of show you kind of where the Russians will have the front line in the north, where the front line in the north will kind of go towards by the end of this. Something like this. This will be the front line. And so the Russians will have a very good solid defense node here to have from the north of Avdiivka. This will be a new Russian defense line. Now, what are the Russians going to do from the north here? So the Ukrainians have in the north here, and I talked about this before, that in the last video, the main purpose of this is to cut off the Konstantinivka-Pokrovsk highway. Now, this doesn't sever, because as I mentioned, there's two main defenses in Ukraine. There's the main Donbass defense in Slavyansk-Toretsk line, and then the Pokrovsk defense line. If you look at satellite images, there's a huge defense line in the more western part of Donbass, and then there's the Slavyansk-Toretsk defense line. These are the two biggest defense, main continuous defense lines. There's obviously trenches everywhere in strong points, but these are kind of like continuous defense lines that, if broken, will, same thing with how the 2014 defense line was a defense line until it was broken, and now we see more faster progress on this front. So now the Russians could stop. The Ocheretyne flower might bloom. They might. Again, the thing with flowers, they bloom in all directions. As I mentioned, they're trying to bloom to the north here. They're trying to bloom to the west towards trying to cut off the one of the main supply routes between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, this highway. Now again, this doesn't cut the supplies. Obviously, you see there's like a road going from Drusivka. There's a highway going to Kramatorsk. So it's just kind of a direct line of communication, a direct highway from Konstantinovka to Pokrovsk will be cut. And so I expect the Ocheretyne flower to bloom to the north, to the west, and then obviously to the west as well. Basically, might be wondering what's the angle, like what, and again, I don't know if this is where the Russians are doing their main, maybe this was just a quick, like, oh, like they made a big fuck up, losing Ocheretyne. The Russians don't actually plan on expanding this. I'm just saying, in case the Russians do continue expanding out of Ocheretyne, first of all, the Ukrainians probably have some defenses here. So in the north here, they have all these water reservoirs. There's a water reservoir here. So this in Kolona and Staromalovka here, once the Russians kind of have a defense line here, as I mentioned before, the Ukrainians will have more defensible places in the north. However, it depends on how much they've actually built defenses there. The Russians could continue moving north and collapse them, or they might want to keep, but if they continue moving north, let's say they expand here and reach kind of this area, and this is the front line, well, then we see this expansion, this giant salient, and so the Ukrainians could, harass them from the east, and they still harass them from the west. And so the Russian, again, with any advance, you need to kind of secure your flanks. The same reason why when they took Ocheretyne, they took these two villages, as I mentioned. They're trying to attack on the more western part right here to secure their gain in Ocheretyne. And so the more they expand, they have to expand elsewhere. It's not like they could just. Usually, you don't want your expansion just to go one way, or else you'll have this very deep salient that you want to avoid. Another place that the Russians could try to cut off this. If this is where the Russians want to do their offensive, this is where the Ocheretyne flower might bloom into. This might be where the Russians focus for their summer offensive, because let's say the Russians have, let's say their new positions are like right here. They try to. They cut the Konstantinovka-Pokrovsk line, and then let's say the new, or maybe they could just push right up here, right? Kind of have this kind of natural road connection cut off. They just need to cut it at one point. They don't need to secure themselves along this entire road. They just need to cut it off at one point, probably in this kind of circle right here, where it kind of goes off to another road. But then, something like this, right? And then, something like that. Maybe they take these 4 villages, and then they have this deep, as you can see here. Let me go here. But, as you saw, this not, if the Russians kind of expand, this is where the extent of the Russian Ocheretyne flower might bloom. Something like this. They could also use this rail line as a defense node. But, again, this, then the Russians will have an expanded flank. They will cut the main highway connecting Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk, and this will secure their flanks. It won't be just one giant highway. But, again, this is something that's definitely doable. Will the Russians throw troops in here to exploit this breakthrough? We shall see. There's another big thing that the Russians could do from the Ocheretyne flower, is this encirclement of the Donetsk-New York agglomeration. And what do I mean by that? First of all, we know that the Russians want to take Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar is one of the main things Russians have been trying to take. Let's say Russians do take Chasiv Yar. What will happen then? The Russians will then be able to focus on these villages in the lowland. The Chasiv Yar, again, is on the high ground. And taking Chasiv Yar basically will the Russians will be able, it will be the Chasiv Yar flower, because then, again, they'll be on the high ground, and they'll be able to take these villages in the south here. The Russians might be able to take Stupuchi, Bilahora. And the main thing, as I saw, and let me show you this. So not only will the Russians have cut this line, the Russians could continuously move north here, kind of maybe secure themselves along this this reservoir right here, right? And kind of around right here. And then the Russians from Chasiv Yar could be, they'll obviously have Chasiv Yar, and then they'll be trying to meet up and sever these 2 villages that connect Konstantinovka and Toretsk. And so, as you can see, there's these 2 separate fronts will meet to encircle Toretsk and New York. So we'll have something like this, something maybe like this, and then this entire line in Toretsk in New York will be cut off. And then they'll force the Ukrainians back to Konstantinovka. And this might be the way the Russians break through and collapse the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk line. They don't need to go through Izium like before. So this will not only deblockade Gorlovka, this will then allow them to just roll up, because then once the Russians have this kind of natural, if this is the new front line, right? Then the Russians could just continuously attack. They could attack do the same thing with Konstantinovka. The Russians could advance from the back here, cut off Konstantinovka from here, and then just cut it off here, and then I'm gonna erase it here. But then then encircle Konstantinovka, and then just continuously move this way, and the Russians could continue moving this way. And as they move this way, the Russians could then just keep advancing this way. The only problem with that, once they go past Konstantinovka, is that if the Russians don't advance more in the south, then kind of the Ukrainians will be able to start attacking them, this way from Pokrovsk itself. So the Russians need to advance here as well. So I kind of showed you where this Ocheretyne flower might bloom. This is good. I'm not saying this will happen. I'm saying this is what could happen, and what I think the Russians could be planning. So, so that's we'll continue seeing how this Ocheretyne flower blooms, because my God, that is a lot of progress in terms of this war. Obviously, it's not like Ocheretyne falling means the collapse of Ukraine. Obviously not, but it's definitely something that's something to look forward to in terms of this is a tactical thing that could lead to a lot of big things. Now, again, one thing is that the first line of defense that the Ukrainians built up after the fall of Avdiivka was the Berdichi-Toninka line. And by the end of this week, that first line of defense has finally fallen. Now, it's been about almost a few weeks since the fall of Orlovka and Toninka. However, Berdichi and Sininovka were very special cases. Half of them, or a lot of them, were on another side of this river here. And so the Russians, they could take everything on the more western part, on the eastern part of this river. You can see this river right here. But anything on the more western side was, if they had to make a bridgehead, and the Ukrainians could continuously attack from their positions on a second line defense they were making right here, and then in Umanska as well here. But because of the collapse of Ocheretyne, again, this is the Ocheretyne flower blooming, the Ukrainians, who were continuously trying to support themselves in the western part of Berdichi, have collapsed. And so these fields between Selidova, Novopokrovka, and Berdichi have been collapsed by the Russians, and the Ukrainians had to fall back to Novopokrovska and Novoselivka Pershi. This is the new line of Ukrainian defense. And not only that, the Ukrainians also just have positions in Umanska, Yasnobronovka, and Natalova. So these are the two Ukrainian positions. However, the Russians will want to clear these up. Again, another big thing is that they want to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. And so they need to take at the very least, Umanska, Yasnobronovka, and Natalova, and push the Ukrainians to they call it the Karlovka water reservoir. I call it the Vochachka River. But anyway, they want to force the Ukrainians to retreat back here. And so then this will push the Ukrainian artillery fully from Donetsk. And not only that, taking Novopokrovska and Novoselivka Pershi will allow the Russians to continuously secure, maybe if they want to continue, if the Russians want to advance towards this towards cutting the highway, taking these villages right here will be very useful in securing the flanks here. In fact, I think that might be what we see. I think we might see a Russian advance towards, this area, take this area right here. This might be the new contact line. And then the Ukrainians will have to fall back all the way to their main defenses in Pokrovsk. And then also this Vochachka River. Now the Ukrainians, the Ukrainians have attacking directly west is going to be very hard for the Russians. They have obviously the Vochachka River as the first line of defense, but they also have a second line of defense. These are kind of the two cities that the Ukrainians have been losing, Selidova and Novogorivka here. These form like a second line of defense. They kind of use these as two kind of ammo depot places, for logistics. While this is the main defense line, but they still have a second defense line here, and then they obviously have then the last third defense line that protects Pokrovsk itself. So the Battle of Donbass is like very much, this is kind of the big picture focus of where the Russians will go. So Berezhny and Semyonovka have fallen because of the collapse of Ocheretyne, and so now the first line of defense is in Russian hands. However, now the battle is, have the Ukrainians built enough defenses to hold off the Russians so that they could prevent them from reaching the Vachachka River, or will everything, in this kind of pocket right here be taken? Maybe this might be taken in the next month or two. We'll see how far the Russians could advance. In the south here, so they took Berezhny and Semyonovka. We saw geolocated footage of the Russians hoisting their flag there. Let's see. What are some other? So I talked about the importance of taking these three villages. As we go more south here, let's talk about Natalova. Some sources are saying the Russians have now entered have captured the eastern part of Natalova, right now the Ukrainians fell back to the center, and that makes sense. The center has more than one-story buildings, so this is a good place for the Ukrainians to make a stand. But it is kind of interesting how the Russians could just, I was thinking that Natalova after Peremyska has been a battleground for like a year or two, that the Ukrainians would have trenched up Natalova to hell, and that attacking directly would have been a pain in the ass, and that the Russians have to attack, from these fields, take the southern part of Umanska, take Yasna Bronovka, kind of use this Vachachka River as their own defense line, and then attack Natalova from the north, because then having that two-part squeeze will squeeze the Ukrainians out in Natalova. But it looks like even without attacking directly, allowed the Russians to have a foothold in the eastern part of Natalova, and I don't think they'll be able to take the center part of the center of the town until the Russians take kind of these fields up in the north here. So we'll see. So a lot of gain. This is some of the biggest gains in the war is happening in the Avdiivka's direction, and a lot of sources are saying that this is kind of where the Russians are going to put their main focus for their offensive. I don't blame them, because it would be an interesting perspective if they put their troops in this breakthrough, and then do what I explained here, because that would be a very good gain. That would be a solid summer offensive. Imagine taking Chasov Yar. Imagine taking Toretsk in New York. Imagine finally pushing the Ukrainians all the way out of Donetsk. That is a solid victory. Now, and it will solidify Russian gains to continue as they continue trying to take Donbass. So that is what's happening. Let's see. So that's like kind of the biggest thing that's happening is this Avdiivka. But again, this is all part of the Donetsk front, and let's continue talking about the Donetsk front. Another big place where the Russians have been having major successes is the Battle of Krasnogorovka. This is a big place that the Russians have been trying to break through to, and there's been a lot of battles here, and this is another place where the Russians have to, again, if they want to save Donetsk, as I call it, it doesn't just help to push the Ukrainians away from the north. They need to push the Ukrainians away from the south here. And again, the Ukrainian defense line runs from Kharkova along the Vachachka River. This is where the where the Russians want to push the Ukrainians back to. However, the Ukrainians still have positions in the southern part of Donetsk where they could still shell Donetsk, and the Russians obviously want to rectify that. And this week we have a lot of progress in Krasnogorivka. I'm kind of surprised. I kind of was expecting that they need to clear up the north and then go attack Krasnogorivka from the north here, but apparently that's not that's not what's looking like it's happening. So as I mentioned last week, I talked about how last week the Russians used motorcycles to land in the southern, these little houses right here, and then in this area right here, I talked about how they used motorcycles and like these giant tanks, these new tanks to help with electronic warfare sensors to try to knock out the drones. They used those giant tanks to do attacks on Krasnogorivka, and not only have the Russians fully secure themselves in the southern part of Krasnogorivka, this area is under complete Russian control. They are now battling for the center of Krasnogorivka. And some pro-Russian sources are saying that the main Ukrainian defenses, which is this what they call the refractory factory, or the refractory factory. That's a tongue twister if I say so myself. But this factory is the main Ukrainian defense line in Krasnogorivka. The fall of this, and the fall of this kind of this business district right here, will basically seal the fate of Krasnogorivka, because then the rest of it is just a bunch of residential areas which we captured very quickly. And sources are saying the Russians have stormed this factory, and battles are going on for this. They're trying to clear out this factory, and it's very hard. So we'll see how fast the Russians could clear this factory out. But if the Russians have cleared this factory, as pro-Russian sources are saying, then it's just the fate of Krasnogorivka is sealed, because then the Russians will just have to clear out this business district, and then it's game over. And then the capture of Krasnogorivka, let's say might be wondering, and then what else has happened? Well, not only that, the Russians are trying to outflank Krasnogorivka from the east here. They managed to capture this kind of gas station right here, and take this roundabout right here, and they're now trying to entrench themselves in these high-rise buildings right here. This is a bold move. I didn't expect the Russians to make a direct attack on the refractory plant this quickly. But again, Ukrainian manpower shortages and Ukrainian is taking a big hit. Not only that, the Russians made a daring attack to take over this kind of main stronghold that the Ukrainians have built in 2014, and they basically took these trenches right here. And this basically completely, if the Russians are able to expand out of this area, this will definitely put a big damper on, they'll start encircling Krasnogorivka. So they managed to take some 2014 trenches right here in a stronghold here. They are attacking the refractory plant, the main defense of Krasnogorivka, directly, and they are trying to get to the flanks of it. Now, it's going to be a bloody fight. I don't know if the Russians, their sources are saying that they haven't completely captured this yet. The battles are still ongoing, so we'll have to continue putting it. Maybe the Russians failed to take this factory, and the Russians will have to just hold their, about a third of Krasnogorivka, and then have to. So it's the battle of Krasnogorivka is still ongoing. It's going to take a while. But, the battle to seal the fate of it is ongoing, and we'll see how the Russians develop their offensive here. Where the Russians will want to go, obviously, is something like this. So, again, they need to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. You might be wondering, so what's the big picture? Where will they be after this here? So let's kind of go zoom in. And here's where the Ukrainians will be pushed back to. They're going to be pushed back to the Ocheretyne River right here. And then let's make this blue, because why not? And the Russians will basically be kind of like right here. So, and then, these fields will serve as like a no man's land. The Ukrainians can't attack because they'll be, again, attacking the fields is very suicidal. They won't be able to do that. And the Russians will basically hold the Ukrainians here. So, the Ukrainians will have a defense line in this red area to defend themselves. But again, if they push back here, the Ukrainian artillery will have to push back to Selidova, to this area. And then, this area is, more for conventional artillery, it's far away from the center of Donetsk, so they no longer will be able to shell it. And for all intents and purposes, the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians away from Donetsk, and that is kind of the goal of all these Russian operations that have been going on for this year. So that's the Donetsk front. A lot of things happening. They are trying to also secure themselves between Pobeba and Grigorivka, trying to defend the flanks here a bit. They're also trying to defend the flanks between Novomikhailivka and Pobeba, and basically use kind of have this be a natural defenses. Now, there's been a bit of an operational pause. I talked about the fall of Novomikhailivka earlier, and basically, the Russians are not, they secure themselves here, and now, again, they need to take Pereskorilivka and Konstantinovka. However, there's been little progress here, except, I guess, solidifying kind of the flanks between Pobeba, Grigorivka, and Novomikhailivka, make a natural kind of defense here, and then that way they could be secure in their gains before they continuously attack. But again, Novomikhailivka took a long time to take. It took a few months. The 79th Air Assault Brigade held it very firmly for the Ukrainians, but they had to retreat. So the Russians are solidifying their gains in Novomikhailivka and trying to solidify their defenses here before they continue their attack here. There's been drones and bombings of Ugledar. I expect that once Konstantinivka and Pereskoilivka fall, that the Russians will do their Ugledar offensive, and so that's going to be a big game changer for the Russians if they manage. Because the reason why they lost it is because they attacked directly, but then they'll be able to attack the Ukrainians from the coal mines here were able to outflank the Russians and push them back. So we shall see how that develops here. Let's continue going to the south here. So again, there's clashes here, and Ugledar is probably going to be another part in the Russian summer offensive. Depends on how beat up the Russian Marines were after taking Novomikhailivka. The Russians are actually active in the Velika Novosilka area as well. The Russians are clearing out the trenches in the south of Ocheretyne, and not only that, they are entering the farms themselves of Ocheretyne. And so I think the Russians are going to try to take these two villages just to secure themselves a bit better. But again, I think this is more of like a probing attack to try to keep Ukrainian forces in this area, on their feet instead of like allowing them to move them to say Ugledar and such like that. But again, the Russians managed to clear out these trenches in the south here and push the Ukrainians back to Ocheretyne itself. So again, a little bit back and forth. They're trying to expand the buffer zone from their main defenses in Zivnita to Bajina and try to clear the trenches in the south of these two villages so that if they want to attack it directly, they can. So some clashes here. The Russians are advancing a little bit to the south of Ocheretyne and definitely puts the Ukrainians on their toes here. On the Zaporozhye front, the Russians are kind of trying to basically solidify themselves in. They're battling for the center of Robotyne, but they're also trying to, they managed to enter Robotyne from the western part. However, they also want to clear out Robotyne from the east and have kind of a gain in the eastern part of Robotyne, so that then they could have a solidified, it's right now back and forth, it clashes in the center, and they want to have a secure center before they continue advancing towards the north and to fully take back Robotyne. There's been some clashes in Verbova. They've been taking one tree line at a time. I think, it's hard to know, I forgot which one. I think they took this tree line or something. Maybe they took this tree line. I forgot exactly which, but again, they're trying to push the Ukrainians away from Verbova, and a little bit at a time. But again, the gains Ukrainians made here over the summer are going very fast down the toilet. In the Kherson front, nothing big happened. The only thing that we got confirmation of is that the Ukrainians are still in Krinky. We kind of assumed that the Ukrainians gave up Krinky, but it turns out the Ukrainians are still in Krinky based on footage of the Russians bombing Krinky. So Krinky is still being contested. Why the Ukrainians are using some of their best Marine troops to do this PR offensive, I have no idea. But yeah. So the Krinky is still being contested. That is the big thing to know about the Kherson front. Let us go to the Bakhmut front. Nothing big happened in Bakhmut this week, actually, in the Chasiv Yar front. The only big thing is the Russians are slowly but surely trying to take this hill right here. They are taking more and more of this hill, and I expect that by the end of next week, they probably will reach the Seversky Donetsk Canal and secure themselves on the southern part, because they want to take this extension of Chasiv Yar. The first step to take Chasiv Yar is to reach the Seversky Donetsk Canal. And while the Russians have taken Bogdanovka and Ivanivska, the next thing they need to do is take Kalinova, because then taking Kalinova will secure themselves in the north of this, and then they'll be able to storm this place from three sides and collapse and have a foothold to continuously advance towards the center of Chasiv Yar. Because then once they reach, again, the whole purpose is to reach this canal, because then they'll be on equal footing, equal height with the Ukrainians. But again, very little of Very little progress. So far, the Russians have mostly this week just focused on trying to take the southern part because that's a good goal. It not only secures Ivanivska, it begins the encirclement of this kind of extension of Chasiv Yar, and this place is getting bombed to hell. So nothing big actually in Chasiv Yar. The Russians, I think they're saying that I do believe that the Russians will, because again, they need to take Chasiv Yar if they want to do the encirclement of Toretsk and New York, as I mentioned earlier. Chasiv Yar is key to that. No changes in the Seversk front. Yeah, no changes. Yeah, no changes on the Le Mans front as well. Yeah, no changes there. There has been some changes in the Kupiansk front actually, and we actually have some big changes this week. By the end of this week, we saw a surprise Russian attack on the village of Klishivka here and Kotlarovka, and the Russians were on the outskirts of this village, and from a daring assault, the Russians managed to capture at least the eastern part of Klishivka and managed this area right here. I have no doubts that the Russians will try to take the rest of Klishivka. In fact, some pro-Russian sources say they've already actually captured Klishivka. And if that's the case, then I bet they're also going to take Kotlarovka as well. So I think by the end of next week, we might see confirmation, unless the Ukrainians do some sort of counterattack, that these two villages will fall. And if these two villages fall, and that's kind of surprising. The Russians, as you know from the fall, the Russians were trying to take these two villages when they were attacking Kupiansk, but they failed to do so. I don't know. Again, there was another territorial defense brigade here that was holding the line here, but they collapsed. Again, this shows that Ukrainian manpower is very bad here, because in the fronts that are quiet, the Ukrainians send the territorial defense. But then, if the Russians activate there, then it's kind of, it's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to hold the line. And if Klishivka and Kotlarovka fall, not only will this secure Russian gains in Tabivka, which they took in the middle of winter, they'll be able to continuously advance this way. And I'm betting you that the Russians will try to advance, take these two villages in Stepova, Novoselivka, and Ivanivka here. And so let's say the Russians do a mini little offensive here and manage to capture something like this. This is one of the main Ukrainian defenses in Kupiansk, because this kind of forces the Russians to go away from Kupiansk. However, the fall of this will force the Ukrainians to go back and defend themselves in the Kupiansk region. Now, but this is the thing, though, is that again, the difference between the distance. So the Russians will have a springboard towards Kupiansk. That is this will allow the Russians to start an offensive towards Kupiansk. But here's the thing. It's not like, if they take these 4 villages, it's over. No. This will solidify Russian defenses a bit, but then you have a bunch of random fields here. Open fields, open everything, and the Russians, if they want to attack and reach the Oskol River, they're going to be attacked relentlessly by FPV drones. By being in the open fields is a death sentence, as we saw as the Russians tried to advance towards Terny in the Le Mans direction. So while the Russians are definitely able to take these 4 villages, and we saw that, with the taking of Klishivka almost, and basically the fall of these 4 villages is almost, is a lot more in the cards now that Klishivka is being taken. But even if these 4 villages fall, Kupiansk is still in good hands for the Ukrainians. The Russians will need to have to make a breakthrough somewhere else, somewhere that they could roll up, somewhere here. And I'm thinking maybe, I don't know, it's going to have to be somewhere in the center here. In the north here, there's nothing in the. They need a breakthrough in the middle here, and kind of divide this front in half, and then roll up from the north here, and then that way they'll be able to, once they roll up from the north, they'll be able to start the Battle of Kupiansk. But they need a breakthrough here, and I think that's what there might be a breakthrough. My thing is between the Le Mans and Kupiansk front, this area. There's gonna be some sort. The Russians will probably try to break through somewhere here, and reach the Oskol River here, and then that way they could advance from the north, and then also the south, and that way they could also start taking Le Mans. So, yeah, a lot of battles for the Kupiansk front after a month or two of being quiet is now active. Another thing is that the Russians have some rumors are that the Russian summer offensive might be in Kharkov. That might be that again. I'm not ruling that out. I'm not Alrighty. So, and then one thing I also want to mention here is that the Russians, as I talked about Kharkov, is that again, it's not. I think it's one of the more likely if the Russians want to do a big aerial offensive instead of like a lower local offensive in the summer. If that is the case, then I definitely think Kharkov will be a center for where the Russians will focus. And reason why there's been some rumors of why Kharkov will be that area. First, a lot of rumors are saying the Russians are clearing the mines between Belgorod and Kharkov. The second is that the Russian Ministry of Defense has started reporting on creating a new army group. Now, the way the Russian Ministry of Defense breaks it down is like the center grouping, the western grouping, the Dnieper grouping, and now they say the northern grouping, which is covers Sumy and Kharkov. And they've been reporting. So there's a new a group that the Ministry of Defense has started reporting on. Not only that, there's been a lot of the missile strikes that the Russians have been doing have been targeting infrastructure and logistics that would help the Ukrainians support themselves in Sumy and Kharkov. So there's a lot of things that are happening that show that Kharkov might be the area that the Ukrainians focused on. There's also been some back and forth in terms of shelling. The Ukrainians are droning Russian oil refineries, and the Russians have targeted more power plants in Ukraine. And the Americans are sending more, more aid to Ukraine. So now that they passed that aid package, they'll be able to they've been trying to send more equipment to Ukraine. So yeah, so that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to give this video a like. Subscribe to my channel if you want to continue getting updates from the Russian-Ukrainian War. Comment your thoughts and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.